Hello everyone, I'm Nitahone, and welcome back for some more Aether Revolt Limited Review. So far I've given my picks for the best commons and uncommons in each color and in artifacts, and now we're going to go a lot deeper into the set with an Archetype guide, covering what each of the two color combinations in Aether Revolt wants you to be doing. We'll be talking about cards in both Aether Revolt and in Kaladesh, as it is important to know what cards from Kaladesh fit best into a particular archetype. We'll also discuss whether or not archetypes stay the same or change from Triple Kaladesh Draft. It should also be noted that cards that are just good in every deck that happens to be in their color, like removal spells, are not really addressed here unless they also have some sort of special synergy with what a particular color pair is trying to do. If you want to hear discussion about just sort of like the best cards in terms of raw power, that's mostly what my other limited review videos have focused on, talking about best commons and uncommons, and you can find discussion about that there. This video, as I'm sure you've noticed, is an especially long one in which I will be talking about a ton of different cards and the synergies they have, and as a result, for these videos I always put timestamps in the description that can allow you to jump around if you prefer, so you can find those below. Before we get started looking at color pairs themselves, I wanted to quickly discuss in broad terms where certain mechanics show up, as this is a good way of figuring out what color pairs are trying to do. Typically, mechanics do not appear on cards of all colors. For example, Fabricate was only on green, black, and white cards in Kaladesh. Both the new mechanics in this set do not appear on cards of all colors. Improvise only appears on the Grixis colors, and Revolt only appears on the Abzan colors. This tells us that red, blue, and black are the most interested in artifacts, while white and green probably don't have as much of a focus on them. Black is the only color with both mechanics. Also, it's clear that green and white are the colors that are most interested in getting Revolt triggers. This is something to keep in mind as we look at the archetypes. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk first about these artifact-centric color pairs. The first of those is blue-red. For every card, we're going to start with the gold uncommon for the color pair. Anytime a new set comes out, at least lately, every two-color combination has a signpost uncommon. That's what Wizards calls them. These cards are generally quite powerful and can obviously only be played with people in that particular color pair, and these cards often serve as indicators as to what a particular two-color combination wants to be doing. For blue-red, that means Maverick Thopterist. This isn't a signpost uncommon that you have to think long and hard about to know what you're supposed to be doing in blue-red. Between the Improvise and the fact that he makes Thopter tokens, you know that the blue-red deck is an artifact-centric deck. In Kaladesh, it was artifact-centric as well, but there was a little bit of an energy sub-theme that isn't quite as prevalent now. Those undercurrents are still there, but they aren't quite as strong as they were before. Additionally, when one looks closely at blue and red, they are the colors with the most cards with Improvise combined between the two of them, meaning that this deck really wants to play a ton of artifacts to effectively use Improvise, and indeed, Maverick Thopterist both plays well with Improvise and helps you out with future Improvise by giving you Thopters. Now let's look at the commons and uncommons in blue and red that give you a payoff for playing artifacts in Aether Revolt. So the first of these is Bastion Inventor, who himself has Improvise. He's got Hexproof, he's a 6-mana 4/4. This is kind of one of the big payoffs you can have in blue-red. These creatures with Improvise, if you can play enough artifacts early, you can power these creatures out or other spells quickly, which is quite impressive and quite powerful. Imagine playing Bastion Inventor on turn 4, and I don't think that's completely impossible in this format. So that's something to keep in mind. You also have an artifact payoff that I think is a little bit more of a build-around. You probably need about 10 artifacts in your deck before efficient construction is well efficient. But once you do, it gets to be an amazing artifact payoff. Metallic Rebuke, another card with Improvise, and I think it might actually be a mainboardable counterspell in Limited, assuming you have, again, maybe about 10 artifacts, because if you can cast this as either Mana Leak or better than Mana Leak for 1 blue, it gets to be a pretty powerful card. Reverse Engineer, typical blue draw spell, except you can make it a lot cheaper with artifacts in play to just draw cards. Trophy Mage, an artifact payoff that's super narrow, though. It's an artifact payoff, but only for artifacts with converted mana cost of 3, exactly 3. So if you have at least one, Trophy Mage might be worth it, and if you have 2 of those, Trophy Mage is definitely worth it. So keep that in mind. One of the best, I think the best blue card with Improvise in Limited is going to be Windkin Raiders. At least at uncommon or uncommon. If you can just power this out, even for 5 mana, a 5-mana 4/3 with flying is a devastating thing to play against somebody. Red, of course, also has some artifact payoffs. This one wants you to throw artifacts away to do damage to your opponent. Not a bad way to get reach. It's not an incredible card by any means, but it's pretty playable if you're in this deck. Enraged Giant, a red card with Improvise that's just, big and scary, evasive with haste. And so if you can play him on turn 4 or 5, he's quite frightening, and this deck can. Ravenous Intruder likes to eat artifacts. And then Sweatworks Brawler is a 4-mana 3/3 with Menace. Again, that's not exactly what you want to be doing for 4 mana, but if you can do it for 3, it's great. And there's also an artifact that's at its best in this deck, I think, because it has Improvise. All the sort of, there's just so many commons and uncommons with Improvise here that this color pair really focuses on wanting to have low curve artifacts. Artifacts in general, any artifact is good if you have all these artifact payoffs. But if you have low curve artifacts, you can power out your Bastion Inventor or Enraged Giant very early and cause some big problems for your opponent. So let's take a look at some low curve artifacts that I think are well suited for this particular deck. Again, basically any artifact's good, but we're going to talk about some specific ones. Cogwork Assembler is sort of just a stand-in for, like any artifact creature who costs 2 or 3, just going to be good in this deck. It's an artifact creature, so you get the payoff. It's a 3-mana 2/3, that's a decent rate, and in the late game it has a little bit of a payoff in that it can make copies of your artifacts. So, nothing super exciting, but it's good in a deck like this one because of the fact that you just want artifacts anyway. Implement of Combustion is a very low curve artifact and probably not worth playing in really any other color pair because it's just not that good of a card otherwise. But if you have 5, 6 cards with Improvise, Implement of Combustion gets to be very good. Helps you get there on your Improvise costs, and it can also help you draw a card in the later part of the game. Implement of Examination is, I think, a little bit better of an implement. Drawing cards for 2 cards for 4 mana is not the worst rate. I think any deck that likes artifacts will be playing Implement, but it's good in this deck too. Same as Pacification Array is good in like any deck, so you probably need to take it early to get it. I think it's a first pickable card, but it's a great card, period. And then the fact that it costs 1 mana makes this deck value it even more because it helps so much with Improvise. Similarly, Renegade Map, a card anyone who's trying to splash is going to want, but it can help you splash while also helping you Improvise. Servo Schematic is great because it puts 2 artifacts into play right away. It's the kind of card that can enable turn 4, 4/4s with haste and trample, which is pretty awesome. Welder Automaton, just another low curve artifact creature with some late game utility. If you're in a board stall, you can just start pinging your opponent. And he's good for Improvise, being low on the curve. Similarly, Watchful Automaton, decent in the later part of the game because of what it can do for you in scrying. But in the early game, you can use it just as another artifact that can also help you Improvise. There's also Aether Swooper, who itself is not an artifact creature, and the same is true of Aether Chaser. Both of these make servos, though, which can help you Improvise, and they're both just efficient, good creatures anyway. So now let's talk about cards from Kaladesh that Blue-Red is going to be wanting. These are what you want to be seeing in the third pack for this particular color pair. An example of that would be Experimental Aviator, just a good uncommon, gives you 2 Thopters who can help you with your Improvise, but they're also just, 2 attackers in the air, while the Aviator is usually a good blocker in the air. Gearseeker Serpent is like probably the dream common or uncommon for you to see. You're already playing a ton of artifacts. He has his cost reduced, sort of similar to Improvise, but even better because you don't have to tap any artifacts. So he's probably close to first pickable in your third pack in a lot of packs if you see him because you really want him. He's a great win condition. He made lots of decks good that wouldn't have been otherwise in Kaladesh. Glintnest Crane can help you draw more artifacts if you get it, and that's another nice payoff. Incendiary Sabotage, not the best card. I have it here in interests of being thorough. I've never really been in a position where I felt like I wanted to cast one or where I thought it would be good for my opponent to cast one. And, maybe this format will be different, but that wasn't true in Kaladesh. But it does like artifacts. You have to sacrifice one. Inventor's Apprentice, if you got a lot of low curve artifacts, having a 1-mana 2/3 around is not bad. Quicksmith Genius helps you loot. Well, it's more of a rummage effect, actually, because you discard the card first. Reckless Fireweaver does some extra damage when you play artifacts. Salivating Gremlins gets bigger when you play artifacts. Tezzeret's Ambition gets better, lets you keep from discarding a card if you control an artifact. Wildfast Wingsmith, kind of in the same group as Incendiary Sabotage. It's not great. I only played it when I was low on playables, but it's a fine card, if you're kind of desperate for playables. Welding Sparks is a great removal spell in any deck, but it does the most damage in a deck that has artifacts. Whirler Virtuoso is, of course, the blue-red gold card from Kaladesh. With the less of a focus on energy, Whirler Virtuoso isn't really going to be powering out a lot of things as frequently unless it's splashed with blue-green, which we'll talk about later. But it's still a 3-mana 2/3 who comes with a Thopter, basically, and that's a pretty good deal. Foundry Inspector, an artifact creature himself, but also reduces the cost of all of your artifacts, so that's great. Then there's the cards you want from other cards you want from Kaladesh that are just artifacts. And these are a few of them. Inventor's Goggles is great as a low curve card, but you also happen to be running a lot of Artificers in these colors, so it'll equip to them for free. Prophetic Prism helps you splash, draws you a card. Puzzle Knots are fine because they do some stuff for you while also helping you Improvise. Same for Skygate. And I also included the, part of the cycle of Weldfast Monitor, and Dukara P-Foul just as the artifact creatures for red and blue in Kaladesh, because artifact creatures are good because they give you both a creature and a way to help you improvise and hit artifact triggers. So let's talk about the rares, because we mostly talk about commons and uncommons in these videos, but there are always rares that are kind of like the ideal rare you would want to get if you were in this archetype, and here's a few of those. We've got Quicksmith Spy and Quicksmith Rebel. They both like for you to have artifacts, and if they stay in play, they can just win you the game single-handedly. Shocking something or drawing a card every turn is nuts, and they can help you just win a game on their own. Free Jam Region, of course, has Improvise and is even crazier of a thing to play on turn 4 than anything we've talked about so far. Inspiring Statuary can give all your non-artifact spells Improvised, and that's pretty awesome. You do need to be running a decent... It's sort of a counterintuitive card, because you need to, A, be running a lot of artifacts to make Improvise worth it, and those artifacts will not gain Improvise if they don't already have it. So it's kind of, a complicated thing, but I think there's probably, if there's any deck for it, it's this one, and you probably have to hit the right, like a sweet spot of non-artifact spells and artifact spells for it to work. And Scrap Trawler's great, just a 3-mana 3/2 that lets you recur things from your graveyard back into your hand whenever other artifacts die, and it's just an artifact creature. There's some rares in Kaladesh too. Saheeli Rise, of course, in this color combination. Planeswalker is usually pretty good. She's not the most powerful ever, but she does some things. Scrying and doing damage, and also she can make copies of your artifacts. Padeem is great, gives your artifacts hexproof, lets you draw cards if you have the highest converted mana cost artifact in play. PNLR makes you a Thopter, pumps artifact creatures, sacrifices artifacts. And Saheeli's Artistry, is good in any blue deck. But if you have a bunch of artifacts, including powerful ones, you're going to be wanting to make copies of those instead of your opponents. So I mentioned it here as well. So that does it for this color pair. This one's the most interested in Improvise. That's where you're going to find the most of it. So we'll move on now to another artifact-centric color pair, and that is blue-black. Blue-black signpost in common is Tezzeret's Touch, which you see here. It's basically an Soul artifact with some extra power. It makes one of your artifacts, including a non-creature artifact, into a 5/5 creature. And when the artifact dies, you get to put it back into your hand. This is actually very powerful, as it means you can be swinging on turn 3 with a 5/5 if you played an artifact on turn 1 or 2, and that probably has the potential to just end games. While blue and black also have Improvise, they don't have as much of it at common and uncommon as blue-red has. However, the blue-black deck has a bit of a different focus, and it's touched on by Tezzeret's Touch, the graveyard. There are lots of black cards that do various things with artifacts in the graveyard, or sacrificing artifacts. Since we just looked at blue cards that like artifacts, we're not going to go over all of those again. Those all basically apply here as well. This time we're going to focus on the black cards that are good with artifacts. There's one card I wanted to talk about specifically in conjunction with Tezzeret's Touch. If you have like a 2 to 3 Tezzeret's Touches, suddenly Ornithopter does become a playable card. It's already got some artifact synergies, but normally it's not that great or playable of a card because it just doesn't do anything on its own. But if you can put Tezzeret's Touch on it and have a 5/5 flyer on turn 3, that's pretty scary. There was a standard deck that did that, so a couple years ago, so it's a scary thing. All right, so let's look at the black cards that like artifacts, since we've already covered the blue ones. We have Aether Poisoner, who makes servos. It's part of that same cycle. We've also got Defiant Salvager, who likes to eat artifacts or creatures and makes himself bigger. There's also, I think, the only black common or uncommon with Improvise, and that is Fen Hauler, a 7-mana 5/5 with can't be blocked by artifacts. But if you have enough artifacts in play, you can of course power him out early, as we just discussed. Ironclad Revolutionary likes to destroy your own artifacts to make himself bigger and make your opponent lose life. Resourceful Return lets you return creatures from your graveyard to your hand, and if you have an artifact, you get to draw a card. Sky Requisitioner is another creature with Improvise, so I stand corrected. It has Improvise, and it also helps you make more servos, more artifacts that can then be sacrificed to things like Ironclad Revolutionary or Defiant Salvager. It's a nice little sort of synergy between those specific cards. Now, let's talk about some artifacts that are especially good in this deck with its little bit of a sacrifice sub-theme here. And those are cards like Servo Schematic, because when it comes into play and when it goes away into your graveyard, you get a servo, so you get value out of sacrificing it. Both the implements have value when sacrificed because they draw you a card, whether they go to their graveyard from their activated ability or whether they go to the graveyard just from getting sacrificed. Filigree Crawler can be destroyed by a sacrifice effect and makes you a Thopter. So that's sort of, the blue-black take on artifacts has a little bit more going on with sacrificing and is a little less interested in Improvise, basically. Here's some cards from Kaladesh you're going to want. You're going to want, of course, the gold uncommon from Kaladesh. It gives you Scry on all your artifacts. You've also got Ambitious Aetherborn, sort of a stand-in for any black card with Fabricate here, because they give you servos, which is great for any artifact triggers or artifact cares about artifact cards you have, and can also be sacrificed to things that like to eat artifacts. You've also got Doomed Operative, a 2-mana 2/2, gets +1/+0, and has Death Touch when you control an artifact. Embrawl Bruiser gains Menace. Experimental Aviator we just talked about. Foundry's Creature has more power. Then we've, again, Gearseeker Serpent, a must-have for this deck by the time we get to the third pack. Glintnest Crane again, of course. Oval Chase Daredevil is just so much value. Like, you can just be attacking with this thing and your opponent's trading with it and you're just like, well, I get him back. And, that's a good way to win. Shrewd Negotiation's pretty good. You can give your opponent a servo token. You can give your opponent an implement or a spell knot and get their best spell. So it's pretty good, and their best permanent, rather. You've also got Underhanded Designs, which helps you drain your opponent when you play artifacts and then turns into a kill spell, so great. Tidy Conclusion, great removal spell, but at its best when you have artifacts. Filigree Familiar especially likes being destroyed by artifacts because also draws you a card. Here's some rares that are good in this particular deck. You've got Marionette Master, who can make a bunch of servo tokens, and anytime an artifact you control is put into a graveyard, it damages your opponent, equal to Marionette Master's power. Padim, we saw before. Syndicate Trafficker also likes destroying artifacts that you control. Mechanized Production can, win you the game on its own, interestingly enough. It can also just make sure you have a steady stream of good artifacts in play. We've got Quicksmith Spy again. Then we've got 2 cards with Implement that were not common or uncommon, and that is Battle at the Bridge. If I said Implement, I meant Improvise. That is Battle at the Bridge, which, if you can improvise, gets to be ridiculous. Can kill anything, gain you a ton of life. And Herald of Anguish, who similarly is also ridiculous. Massive flying demon, makes your opponent discard cards, can eat artifacts to do other things like kill your opponent's creatures. And of course, Tezzeret the Schemer, who's not the most powerful planeswalker ever in Limited, but pretty good if you're in this particular deck, which if you got there on artifacts, Tezzeret's worth playing in his colors. So then there's also the red-black Artifact Aggro deck, and it also has a bit of a sacrifice sub-theme. We saw the cards in red that like to sacrifice things, artifacts, when we talked about blue-red, and we saw them also in black. So there's a bit of a sacrifice sub-theme there. There's also a clear focus on Weldfast Engineer here, that he wants you to be playing artifact creatures specifically, because he pumps them +2/+0, one of your choice every turn. So he sort of incentivizes you to play that. We've already talked about all the other black and red cards that like artifacts. So, basically, that's what Weldfast Engineer wants you to do. This is also going to be the most aggressive color pair that likes artifacts, basically because you've taken blue out of the equation. Blue is not an aggressive color almost ever, and and black and red can be aggressive, and they are together. This is the kind of artifact deck where you're not, ultra concerned about Improvise either. Blue has a lot of that. Instead, you're just like playing artifact creatures and turning them sideways and trying to kill your opponent with them. There's one more thing I want to talk about before we move on from the artifact-centric archetypes, and that is the idea of splashing. Since these 3 colors all like artifacts, it won't be uncommon to want to try to splash, especially for the gold card of a color pair that isn't in one of your main colors. However, I don't think it'll be super easy to splash in this format, at least in these colors, just as it wasn't easy to splash in these colors in Kaladesh. You have to rely on picking up a rare 2-color land in Kaladesh, Spire Bluff Canal basically, or the rare land in Aether Revolt, Spire of Industry, which also likes artifact, or on picking up multiple copies of Expedition Map and Prophetic Prism. The good news is, all of these decks like artifacts. You don't have to feel too bad about picking up either of these cards with a high pick, as they have good synergy with your deck anyway. I don't think splashing is wise unless you pick up some combination of 2 of these things, like 1 Renegade Map, 1 Spire Bluff Canal, 1 Prophetic Prism, 1 Spire of Industry, any combination thereof. And then you should probably do it, especially if you've already got the gold card. Obviously, the gold cards from both of these colors, from all 3 of these color pairs, work well together. All right, so now let's move on to the more revolt-centric color pairs, and those are black and white and green-white. Black-green, it's worth noting, has revolt, but as we'll see, it has a completely different focus than black-white or green-white. The black-white gold card is Hidden Stockpile. The stockpile itself has Revolt, an indicator of some of the focus of this color pair, and the stockpile also helps you activate Revolt. This might not sound like a big deal, but there isn't really another card in this format that does both. So this is a powerful thing to have around if you're trying to build a Revolt deck, especially because the stockpile even makes you servos when you have hit the Revolt trigger, which you can then sacrifice to scry and then get another servo, a pretty nice loop. Now, let's look at the common and uncommon cards with Revolt in black and white that would love to play alongside this stockpile. First of all, you've got Airdrop Aeronauts gains you life if you hit Revolt. It's just an efficient beater in the air if you don't hit it. You've also got Countless Gears Renegade, a 2-mana 2/2 in the early game. In the late game, if you've got Revolt rolling, and then you get yourself also a Servo token, who itself can be sacrificed and help you get more Revolt. You've also got Deadeye Harpooner, who can turn into a removal spell with legs if you hit Revolt. Decommission, a card people will be mainboarding just as they were Appetite for the Unnatural, and it gets even better when you have Revolt. It turns into Appetite for the Unnatural, basically, when you have it. Night Market Aeronaut comes into play with a +1/+1 counter if you hit Revolt. Vengeful Rebel, another removal spell with legs when you hit Revolt, and probably the card that's received the most buzz in this entire set, which is impressive because it's an uncommon. Fatal Push, going to be great in every constructed format, basically. Also pretty good in limited, and if you hit Revolt, it gets even better. So, triggering Revolt can happen sort of organically. I mean, games of Magic, usually things go to the graveyard at one point or another. But there are ways of sort of abusing Revolt, of making sure you can trigger Revolt. We already saw an example of that with the black-white-gold card, the Hidden Stockpile. Well, there's other ways to trigger Revolt, too. One of these is Ally Evasion. You can use it as a decent combat trick, or you can use it to bounce your own creatures so you can get Revolt going. There's Conviction, which I don't advise as being amazing. I mean, I think Revolt will happen organically enough that you're not like, man, I'm going to play this Conviction. But it does work. In the interest of thoroughness, it can trigger Revolt for you because you can return it to your hand and then you have Revolt ready to go. Because all Revolt checks for is if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield at some point during your turn. There's also Restoration Specialist, a card that's just like all about value. 2-mana, 2/1, and if you're playing enough artifacts and enchantments, you get back 2 cards from your graveyard when you sacrifice it, which also sets up Revolt. And then one of the best ways, I think, of triggering Revolt is just Felidar Guardian, because it makes sure whatever creature you exile will trigger the Revolt because it left the battlefield. Then it comes back into play, gets the Revolt trigger. Felidar Guardian, of course, also has other uses, makes aura-based removal fall off, and it can also make you abuse any other into the battlefield ability, not just Revolt. We also have Defiant Salvager, who we saw earlier, can eat artifacts, and then something left the battlefield, and you get Revolt. Gonti's Machinations, kind of like Conviction, I don't advise playing, but, you know, it can definitely activate Revolt and gain you some life, I guess. Implement of Improvement, both implements, actually, are pretty good in this deck because they do a little thing that gets you a little bit of value, draw you a card, but they also set up Revolt. So these are the easy ways to sort of trigger Revolt. Keep in mind that you don't have to be like forcing these things. I wouldn't advise taking most of these very early, other than maybe Felidar Guardian, who has a lot, or Restoration Specialist. But once you're sort of in that deck and you can pick up these cards late in packs, they have more synergy than you would think. They're going to be decent with cards that have Revolt. So that's something to keep in mind. But remember, I think Revolt in general isn't really an archetype that you really have to push. You really have to pick up, you don't have to pick up any of these cards for your black-white deck to be good. You have a black-white good stuff deck. You're doing stuff. You're just attacking your opponent, occasionally getting Revolt. You've got usually the best removal in the format, and I think that's probably true in black and white. So you don't need these things, but this is the way black and white can synergize together. There's also some cards you want from Kaladesh, of course. Of course, the black, white, gold card, Restoration Gearsmith, is just insane. It was an amazing card to play in Kaladesh. Gets you something back from your graveyard. Works well with the Felidar. Works well with getting blinked. Glint Sleeve Artisan is a stand-in for any creature that makes servos, because those are just all going to be pretty good in this particular deck. Acrobatic Maneuver lets you flash things, which means, again, you get to exile something. Let's say it has Revolt, and then it comes into play and Revolt triggers. You also get to draw a card off of it. And of course the Puzzle Knots, easy ways to trigger Revolt for some value as well, by sacrificing your Puzzle Knots. There's some rares who are best suited for this deck. Aether Geode Miner, a 2-mana 3/1. Basically you can make sure you have Revolt every turn. If you have them in play, you can just attack, and then pay the 2 energy, and then bring it back into play, and you suddenly have Revolt. Call for Unity is an Anthem effect that gets bigger and bigger the more times you Revolt. So if you have lots of ways to Revolt multiple times, like Aether Geode Miner, gets ridiculous. And Solemn Recruit, 3-mana 2/2, gets bigger when you trigger Revolt by destroying one of your own permanents or having it leave the battlefield or whatever. And it gets bigger and bigger. So that's sort of the black-white take on Revolt. There's also green-white Revolt, of course. And in green-white, our signpost in common is Renegade Rallier. The Rallier pulls you in a couple of directions. First, he asks that you be able to trigger Revolt to get the full value out of him, since he can do something quite powerful in returning a permanent with converted mana cost of 2 or less from your graveyard. Second, he asks that you play things with relatively low mana costs. It is worth noting that nothing about the Rallier pulls you in the direction that green-white was in Kaladesh, and that was into a go-wide strategy. A deck that is loaded with ways to make tokens can still be achieved, but it will lean pretty heavily on the Kaladesh pack. There's no Fabricate in Aether Revolt packs, for example. Neither green nor white has a critical mass of ways to create tokens in Aether Revolt, and there are not a ton of payoffs for doing it anyway. So for now, let's look at the green and white commons and uncommons with Revolt. We already looked at the white ones. I just have them here again to refresh your memory. But now we're going to talk about the green ones as well. We've got Hidden Herbalists, which, does its best impression of Burning Tree Emissary, gives you some mana when you play it that you can use on something else. Lifecraft Cavalry comes into play as a 6/6 Trampler if you can Revolt. Narnum Renegade, a decent 1 mana 1/2. It's just a good... a creature for 1 with Death Touch is always playable, especially if it's a 1/1 or a 1/2, and then it gets even bigger if you get Revolt going. Silkweaver Elite lets you draw a card. It turns into a cantrip if you get it going. So these are the Revolt enablers. It's worth noting that our gold card, our Renegade Rallier, can get back both Countless Gears Renegade, which I guess is on flavor, and Hidden Herbalists, and Narnum Renegade. And when he does, since Revolt already had to have triggered for him to be doing it, when you get any of them back, you're going to get your Revolt trigger. So that's going to be sort of one of the sweeter things you can do in this deck is play your Renegade Rallier and get back your Countless Gears Renegade who comes with a servo, or get back your Narnum Renegade who comes back as a 2/3. Again, a Renegade. It's on flavor. Hidden Herbalists, I don't know what it's doing there. It's not quite on flavor, but it does the same thing. So that's one of the sweeter things you can do. Obviously, getting back any 2-drop is good. Let's look at some Revolt enablers. Of course, we already looked at the white ones, which we have here. But there's also some green ones. Not a ton. But Scrounging Bandar is a Revolt enabler in sort of a less obvious way. It's a 2 mana 2/2. Basically, it comes into play with +1/+1 counters. And on your upkeep, you can move the +1/+1 counters on the Bandar wherever you want. And that means for free, you can sacrifice it and put 2 counters or on one thing, or move a couple counters around, and then you have Revolt active for your creatures with Revolt. There's also Unbridled Growth, which helps you fix, which is nice anyway if you want to be splashing. And it also helps you sacrifice, it helps you get Revolt by sacrificing itself. There is also Implement of Ferocity, the green implement, which is fine. Most of the implements are fine. They're not exciting to play, but if you're in a Revolt deck, suddenly they get a lot more value. So that sort of does it for green-white. But before we leave these Revolt colors, the question again that we asked about the 3 colors that are interested in doing artifact-based things is, how can you splash? Is it easy to splash? And I think the answer is yes. It's a lot easier to splash in these colors. Mostly because of the inclusion of Unbridled Growth in green. You can't be like black-white and splashing green, I guess. But you can be green-white, splash black, or green-black, splash white. And Unbridled Growth helps you fix, and it also helps you activate your Revolt triggers. And the same with Renegade Map. Helps you fix, also activates Revolt triggers. So they fit perfectly. And then, of course, in Kaladesh, you have 2 really good fixers in Wild Wanderer and Servant of the Conduit. So splashing is going to be a lot easier. There's also some cards you, of course, want from Kaladesh in addition to these that help you splash. Again, you have your creatures that come into play with artifact tokens. These are good because throwing these artifact tokens away is an easy way to get Revolt. It's also good with any other blink effects and blink effects like Revolt and vice versa. Got acrobatic maneuver again, and both puzzle knots in this color pair again as well. So that does it for green-white. Again, like black-white, I think it can sort of just be a green-white aggro deck that has a little bit of Revolt synergy, but you can really get there in a very synergistic deck if you pick up some of the things that we talked about here. Now let's move on to red-white. We're sort of done talking about the 2 sort of big mechanics in this set. The rest of the archetypes in this video are all just, they're sort of self-contained. They don't have as much overlap with other archetypes. So let's look first at red-white, where our signpost uncommon is Renegade Wheelsmith. Like all the gold cards, this is a pretty strong card. A 3 mana 3/2 who makes a creature unable to block when it taps is a great card. You would play that in any aggressive deck. This indicates that red-white, as usual, wants to be turning its creature sideways until the opponent is dead, and wants to start quickly. But there's an additional thing going on here, and it is the same as it was for red-white and Kaladesh. Renegade Wheelsmith is encouraging you to play vehicles as well, since it does what it does, not only when it attacks, but also when it taps, period. So the archetype for red-white is aggro, with a little bit of vehicles thrown in. Basically, red-white is the best color pair for using vehicles because of bonuses like this one. Let's see what other payoffs for vehicles there are at common or uncommon in red-white in Aether Revolt. So one of those we have is Reckless Racer, a nice 3 mana 2/3 with first strike. Obviously, it's weird. It's weird to me anytime we have a creature with first strike and lower power than toughness. You don't see it very often. But I think they probably at one point had him as a 3/2, but it made it so he could crew far too many things. But anyway, when he taps, you get to rummage, something we talked about earlier. You get to discard a card and draw a card. It's a nice little bonus to have when you're crewing a vehicle and smashing your opponent's face in. In this set, there's also a couple of auras that work on vehicles or creatures in Aether Revolt, and I'm not sure how I feel about them. I don't think I love them. I'm always a little skeptical about auras because they're just so easy to get you blown out. Your opponent just bounces your vehicle and you've lost the aura, or they destroy your vehicle and you've been 2 for 1, and it's just bad. But I'm probably going to try playing them myself and see what happens before I make any final conclusions. But Siege Modification, you can make a vehicle permanently into a creature as long as Siege Modification stays on it. Doesn't need to be crewed anymore, and it gets +3/+0 and has first strike. Similarly, we've got Aerial Modification, which does the same thing, except it gives flying and +2/+2 instead of +3/+0 and first strike. And there is also Aeronaut Admiral, who I like a lot, because it doesn't ask you to jump through nearly as many hoops as these other 3 cards do. It just says, your vehicles have flying, period. And it's a 4 mana 3/1 flyer, which is a fine rate anyway. There's also Caught in the Brights, which is not like a really big vehicle payoff. But if you play vehicles with Caught in the Brights does get better. You can use it to exile a creature that making it just not being able to attack or block isn't enough. It has a good activated or static ability, and you want to get rid of it, period. And Caught in the Brights lets you do that more if you're running a few vehicles. Now, there aren't a ton of payoffs for playing vehicles, as you can see here. And I think that's because R&D didn't want people to go crazy on vehicles. As we've learned from playing Kaladesh, you don't want to be playing too many vehicles. You've got to have enough creatures to crew those vehicles, and the more vehicles you play, fewer creatures you can have. So, 3 or 4 vehicles is kind of where you want to top out. And, obviously red-white plays vehicles well, but you still don't really want to be getting more than 3 or 4 of them. And as a result, I wanted to talk about the 4 vehicles at common and uncommon in Aether Revolt and talk about my rankings for them, which ones you should be wanting to get the most if you're in red and white. Or really, this applies to every color pair that wants to be aggressive. But red-white's going to use them the most effectively because of the cards we can see here. And so this is sort of my hierarchy of common and uncommon vehicles in the set. Untethered Express is crazy good. It's going to be a common way to first pick a card to begin a draft. 4 mana, 4/4 with Crew 1. Crew 1, what are they thinking? But gets a +1/+1 counter when it attacks too, so it just gets bigger. Daredevil Dragster has Crew 2, and he's only a 4/4. But he does some pretty sweet stuff. As long as he's attacked or blocked twice, each time he gets a velocity counter. Then, once he has 2 velocity counters, you get to sack it and draw 2 cards. So, it doesn't stay in play, but it basically reloads your hand while it's also probably done some damage to your opponent or their board. Then there's Iron Tread Crusher, who's sort of like the bottom of the barrel playable vehicle. There are better vehicles in Kaladesh that you can get, but Iron Tread Crusher's fine as a 4 mana 6/6. Crew 3 is kind of high. There's also Consulate Dreadnought, who works the most effectively if you get those cards that make your vehicles into creatures that don't need to be crewed. That's just kind of a silly thing you can pull off in draft. But Crew 6 is a huge amount of crew. Like, it's pretty hard to consistently Crew 6. You're tapping down a lot of your board, and you're leaving yourself open to a lot of things. And it doesn't have any sort of protection from removal. It's an artifact, so it's easily destroyed in this format. So I don't love it. Again, probably a card I'll play with to see, maybe I'm wrong about it, but I don't think I am. We saw that anything higher than Crew 3 and really higher than Crew 2 was not the most playable thing in Limited in Kaladesh. So this deck is also just an aggro deck, and I wanted to talk about a few cards that are just aggro creatures, not with special vehicle synergies. We've got Aether Chaser, which is a 2 mana 2/1 with first strike, makes more creatures. Frontline Rebel has sort of a secret vehicle synergy, if you will. First of all, it's a 3 mana 3/3, which is great for red. Red doesn't usually get that without downsides, and it has a downside. Has to attack every turn. But with vehicles, you can keep from smashing your Frontline Rebel into your opponent's 4/4 because you can instead crew your vehicle who can actually attack into that 4/4 and use your Frontline Rebel to do it. Also has high power, so it can crew a lot of vehicles. Combat Tricks are also going to be good in any aggressive deck. Invigorated Rampage, an example of that, as is Precise Strike. Alley Evasion is another combat trick, and you can also do some other silly things with it that we talked about earlier. Audacious Infiltrator, just a great little aggressive creature. Can't be blocked by servos, basically, or any other artifact creatures. 2 mana, 3/1. Cruise all the vehicles despite only being 2 mana. So that's a pretty good deal. So, there's a lot of other low curve, white and red cards we could talk about, but these are just sort of a taste of that. Some of the more interesting ones that do specific things, maybe with vehicles, and in some cases not so much. But what do you want from Kaladesh if you're in this archetype? Well, you definitely want Veteran Motorist. That guy is, the gold card from Kaladesh. He lets you scry, for one thing, which is great, and he crews vehicles. When he crews them, he makes them bigger, and he crews them well, because he's got 3 power for 1 mana. There's Start Your Engines here. Not a card I advise playing, but here in interest of wanting to be thorough, I guess if you end up with the Dreadnought deck, Start Your Engine's going to be pretty good because it'll turn the Dreadnought into a creature. Spireside Infiltrator, again, a creature with 3 power can crew almost everything that's worth playing anyway, and it deals 1 damage every time it crews or taps. Period. Speedway Fanatic, when it crews, it gives things haste. Gear Shift Ace, even better. When it crews, it gives things first strike. And Built to Smash and Built to Last are so good with vehicles. They're good in any aggressive deck, but Built to Lasting on your vehicle that would have died otherwise is amazing. And Built to Smashing and just finishing off your opponent is amazing. And I also have here the 3, I think, most playable vehicles at common or uncommon in Kaladesh. Renegade Freighter is obviously the best of these. These aren't in any particular order. I also really like Ovalchase Dragster. It's just so easy to crew. And Skyskiff, of course, is, easy to crew and can help you have some reach to fly over your opponent's creatures. There's also some rares in both sets that are good in this deck, of course. You have Depala, who's like the dream for you to open in the 3rd pack if you've picked up a couple good vehicles and are in red-white. You're going to have a lot of dwarves, too, because those 2 colors have a lot of them, and she makes your vehicles bigger, and she can help you draw even more vehicles and dwarves. Cultivator's Caravan, a very good rare vehicle that can help you fix. It can help you just kill your opponent, too, as a 5/5. Fleetwheel Cruiser, great rare vehicle that just turns into a creature the first turn without being crewed. Sky Sovereign, console flagship, one of the biggest bombs in the format. Lightning Bolt's something when it comes into play. Then it's just a huge flyer. Does it every time it attacks, too. Of course, Smuggler's Copter, which, we all know what that is from Constructed. Srom Senior Edificer is a rare from Aether Revolt that works pretty well because he lets you draw a card every time you play a vehicle. You've probably also got a few auras and maybe even a few equipment, and he's a dwarf, so there's that. Aether Sphere Harvester is a great vehicle in Aether Revolt as well. With only crew 1, it's a 3/5 flyer, and it also brings some energy with it to help you gain life. Heart of Kiran I don't like a whole lot. It's not terrible. At least the crew 3 gives you a creature with flying and vigilance, but that's a lot of crew, and if you end up with a planeswalker, most of the time in limited, you're not, there's going to be situations where, maybe you would rather remove a loyalty counter from your planeswalker, but a lot of the time you're not going to want to. But then there's Peace Walker Colossus, who's like amazing if you're in this deck. Again, if you're in the Dreadnought deck, it can be used to turn one of your vehicles into a creature without needing to be crewed at all. It does have a high crew cost itself, but it's big and it can turn vehicles into creatures. So you really only want Peace Walker Colossus in this deck, not many other places. So that does it for red-white. Just an aggro deck that really loves its vehicles. Every aggro deck likes them. Red-white loves them. So let's move on now to the next color pair, which is blue-green, where the signpost in common is Rogue Refiner. A 3 mana, 3/2. The Refiner both gives you energy and draws you a card. I'm in. Love cards like that myself. Of all the color pairs, blue-green seems to be the one that is the most interested in energy in Aether Revolt. And that was true in Kaladesh too, but now it seems sort of like every other color pair has lost interest in energy, and blue-green has sort of amped it up. Rogue Refiner tells us that we will be wanting energy, so let's see what cards there are that use energy in Aether Revolt at common in blue and green. You've got Aether Swooper, who we've seen before. It can use energy to make servos. You've got Shielded Aether Thief, a nice little blocker who can make energy anytime it blocks and can pump energy into drawing a card, which is great. Shipwreck Morore, not the most exciting thing, but it is a card that, it vacillates between a 4/1 and a 0/5 whatever you need. Aether Herder is a card that is a lot like Aether Swooper, except it's bigger, doesn't have flying, but it does the same basic thing. You've also got Aether Stream Leopard, which I think is one of the better common green cards, maybe the best common green card. I think I said that in my other limited review videos. 3 mana, 2/3. It gets Trample. It has Trample, and it can get bigger if you keep pumping energy into it. Pima Aether Seer. Now, this is an interesting one because I don't think its actual use of energy is all that good. It makes something block. So yeah, you can kill a creature. Maybe your opponent doesn't want to die. But it can give you so much energy. Like, it can give you 4 or 5 energy without a lot of effort. And that's a lot for one card, especially at common or uncommon. So it helps fuel all these other cards we're looking at here. There's also an artifact and consulate turret that can make energy, and it's sort of a really bad win condition. You can use it to ping players, and maybe that's a good way to do 4 or 6, but probably not going to get there just with consulate turret, but it's around. You've also got High Spire Infusion, which doesn't use energy, but makes you energy. And you've also got Skyship Plunderer, who can multiply counters of any kind, but, well, not multiply, but it adds a counter of any kind to any permanent or player that you want when it does combat damage, and this includes energy, so you can make sure you get a little more energy. Similarly, Malphus Revolutionary, a great creature anyway, does the same thing both when it enters the battlefield and leaves the battlefield. So even blue-green doesn't have a ton of energy around, but I think because Kaladesh pack has enough energy stuff that people are going to be less interested in than they were before, because there's less energy synergy in general in this set, and you already have the most. I think you're going to be able to pick up enough in Kaladesh to get there. And you can even get there just here. Like, if you just get Aether Stream Leopard and ways to make energy, like all of these other energy creatures, you're going to win some games, I think. So here's what you want from Kaladesh. You want Aether Meltdown, great removal spell, happens to give you energy. Aether Theorist gives you energy, and you can use that same energy to scry. You've also got Attune with Aether, which I forgot to mention when talking about splashing earlier. It's another green card that helps you splash. There's also Imperial Voyager, the blue-green gold card, makes energy when it hits players. Era of Innovation, which can just turn into an energy engine if you have enough artifacts and artificers, and itself can use energy to draw you cards. Glimmer of Genius draws you cards and gives you energy. Janjit Sentry is kind of pricey on the energy, and I think it got a little worse. It already was sort of an underwhelming card because of how expensive it was, but I think it got a little worse because it's going to be a little bit harder to make energy even for blue-green than it used to be. Minister of Inquiries is a card that I was pretty down on in my Kaladesh Limited review, but I was wrong. If you can make enough energy, it's a good way to win a game in a board stall. I've done it myself, and I'm sure many others have. Servant of the Conduit gives you energy, and you can use it to fix. Then you've got Thriving Rhino and Thriving Turtle, the thriving creatures. And one of the best payoffs is not Decoction Module, but it does make you energy. Best payoffs, though, is Fabrication Module, which is insane. Like, it's an energy payoff that doesn't actually use any energy, which means you can use it on other things, and that makes it amazing because anytime you gain energy, you make a creature bigger. So Fabrication Module is great. If I had, 6 or 7 cards that made energy after the first 2 packs, I would be all in on Fabrication Module, almost even as a first pick, unless there's a crazy bomb in the pack, and then just take everything with energy on it and be pretty happy. So that does it for the commons and uncommons in Kaladesh and Aether Revolt. Let's look at some rares. We've got big, scary Aetherwind Basker, who's a 7-mana 7/7 with Trample. Also makes you tons of energy to use on whatever you want. He can use it to pump himself. You've also got Greenbelt Rampager, which, I think it might have more of a shot in Constructed than it does in Limited, but it's, if I had a lot of energy in my deck, I'd probably play it. You can use it on turn 1 just to make 1 energy if you want. Not the most exciting thing, but then later it's just, it's a 2-mana 3/4, theoretically, basically anyway. There's also the ridiculous Aethertide Whale, who's a 6-mana 6/4 with flying, who's basically impossible to kill and makes you lots of energy. There's also Gonti's Aether Heart, which also makes you a lot of energy if you have enough artifacts. And you can use it to take an extra turn, which is nice. Then you've got Aether Squall Ancient from Kaladesh, who can bounce everything, makes you energy just as a upkeep trigger, which nothing else really does. Architect of the Untamed gives you energy trigger every time you play a land and makes big beasts. Bristling Hydra brings energy with him, can use it to become hexproof. Confiscation Coup doesn't really need any other energy to be good, but if you have a lot, being able to steal even more is even better. So that does it for blue-green. Likes energy. That's really what it focuses on more than any other color pair does in this new format. And I think it was already sort of the case in Kaladesh. It was definitely the best at making energy. So that's something to keep in mind. Now we will go ahead and move on to our next color pair, which is black-green, where our signpost uncommon is Winding Constrictor. Luckily, this signpost uncommon more or less beats you over the head with what it wants to do. It wants you to focus on putting counters on things, and most specifically, it is interested in +1/+1 counters. It does come with the bonus of also providing you with extra energy, but black and green on their own don't have a ton of cards that care about energy in Aether Revolt, but they do have lots of cards that care about +1/+1 counters. In Kaladesh, of all the decks, black-green was the most interested in +1/+1 counters, but it was also a good deck at going wide because of the Fabricate mechanic. In Aether Revolt, the deck is more focused on +1/+1 counters than it was in Kaladesh. Let's look at the other commons and uncommons that deal with +1/+1 counters in Aether Revolt. Despite the fact that Fabricate is gone, there's still lots of cards in Aether Revolt who like +1/+1 counters or produce them. So one example of this is Defiant Salvager. We've seen him a couple times already. He can sacrifice artifacts or creatures and get counters himself. If you've got the Constrictor in play, you get to put another one. Foundry Hornet is a big payoff for playing with +1/+1 counters. It's already a 4-mana 2/3 flyer is not the worst rate already, and on top of that, if you have even one creature with a +1/+1 counter, your opponent's creatures get -1/-1 till end of turn. This could kill a lot of things, including servos, and it could also make your attack that turn favorable in a way that it wasn't before. We've also got Ironclad Revolutionary, who we've seen before, who destroys artifacts, can sacrifice artifacts when he comes into play, and gets counters. Night Market Aeronaut, a card with Revolt that comes with a counter if you hit Revolt. Then there's also Lifecraft Awakening, which you can use on any artifact to make into a creature if it's not already. If you do this, you just have a large creature with +1/+1 counters, and it gives you all these other +1/+1 counter payoffs. You've also got Lifecraft Cavalry, who comes with counters if you can Revolt. Lifecrafter's Gift, which I think is another very big +1/+1 counter payoff, because it's a stupid combat trick. Even though it costs 4, it can do so much. If you have several creatures in play with +1/+1 counters, you probably just leveled your opponent's battlefield. They attacked you thinking they had favorable attacks, and suddenly all your creatures get, +2/+2. At worst, it gives one creature 2 +1/+1 counters. And at best, it does a lot more than that. We've got our friend Maulfist Revolutionary, who doesn't only add energy counters, but adds +1/+1 counters. Another creature with Revolt who likes counters. And then one of the best uncommons in the set, Ridgescale Tusker, who gives your whole team +1/+1 counters and is a 5-mana 5/5. Scrounging Bandar. Finally, we have a good Bandar, you guys. The Wily Bandar was terrible. Here is a good Cat Monkey. And this one is a 2-mana 2/2, basically. And you can move the counters around. We talked about it earlier. There's also, of course, Untethered Express. Good in any deck, including, the red-white deck likes vehicles. This deck likes +1/+1 counters, and Untethered Express has them. There's also Verdant Automaton, who gives itself +1/+1 counters in the later game, theoretically. And Implement of Ferocity, which can put a counter on a creature for 1 mana. You can only do it at sorcery speed, though. So those are all the different things you can do with +1/+1 counters, the payoffs for them, the ways to make them. And here's what you want from Kaladesh. First of all, Aetherborn Marauder, one of the big payoffs for having +1/+1 counters in the set. Going to be very good in your deck if you've gotten there in your first 2 packs, because it can just get big. You can choose just how big you want him to get. It's usually dangerous to move all your counters to him unless you're going for the kill right away. But moving 1 or 2 and having him be a 4/4 or 3/3 with flying and lifelink is great. And Armorcraft Judge, which I like even more, is an amazing +1/+1 counter payoff. You get to draw a card for each creature you have with a +1/+1 counter. Even if you only have 1, it's a pretty good card. And then if you have any more than 1, it gets to be kind of silly. Fairgrounds Trumpeter loves it when you put +1/+1 counters on things. It gets one itself at the end of turn. It only does it once. If you do it 3 times in a turn or once in a turn, it still only gets 1 counter. So keep that in mind. We've got Hazardous Conditions, which kind of didn't get there on being worth playing most of the time in Kaladesh. Wasn't a bad sideboard card. And I still don't think it'll really get there, but maybe it has more of a chance. There are more synergies now for +1/+1 counters. Any creature with Fabricate fits in Ambitious Aetherborn, kind of the tie-in. They come with +1/+1 counters when you want them to, or with servos. Durable Handicraft, a nice little card for making all of your creatures gain +1/+1 counters. Can also give the whole team +1/+1. Fretwork Colony, who if you have the Winding Constrictor, this is one of my dreams of the format, is to be like Fretwork Colony turn 2, Winding Constrictor turn 3, and then you get 2 +1/+1 counters every upkeep on your Fretwork Colony, which is already a scary thing to see early. Then we've got another creature with Fabricate. We've also got Hunt the Weak, which, it's a nice removal spell anyway for green, and if you're liking +1/+1 counters, it's even better. Seed Sculptor, which was a great green common, still going to be great. Gives +1/+1 counters to whatever you want. Thriving Rats, you know, it was kind of the most underwhelming of the Thriving cycle, at least, well, Thriving Ibex is close too. But it does get +1/+1 counters. Lawless Broker puts counters on things when it dies. Long Tusk Cub was a great creature anyway, makes energy for you and likes counters. Another creature with Fabricate and another of them. These are sort of the ones that I think are worth playing the most are, you know, Peam Outrider, Weaponcraft Enthusiast, and Malfist Squad's fine too. High Spire Artisan is okay as well. Subtle Strike, you know, a great little sort of trick / removal spell in the set is going to be just as good as it already was. Thriving Rhino likes +1/+1 counters. And then we've got Fabrication Module again. This time, we're interested in the +1/+1 counter part the most, but we don't have a ton of ways of making energy, but it can make energy on its own, so it might be worth it. Iron League Steed, an artifact creature with Fabricate, so it comes with counters too. Now let's look at rares who have some +1/+1 counter synergy. We've, of course, got Animation Module, which is amazing. It turns every time you get a +1/+1 counter into an opportunity to make a servo. Top of that, you can choose any permanent you want to give that permanent or player another counter of any kind. So, of course, Verdurous Gearhulk is just ridiculous in any deck anyway. But, you know, you're going to get the most mileage out of him here. Bristling Hydra likes counters. Cultivator of Blades, another creature with Fabricate, also can pump your whole team. Syndicate Trafficker can sack artifacts and get counters. Yeheni Undying Partisan gets counters anytime a creature an opponent controls dies. Greenwheel Liberator gets 2 counters if you revolted, so it's a 2-mana 4/3 sometimes. And Rishkar Pima Renegade, I think, is a very, very good rare in the set anyway. It gives you, it has +1/+1 counter payoffs of its own. First of all, it makes 2 counters. On top of that, any creature you have with a +1/+1 counter on it turns into Lana War Elves. So you can pump out some crazy things. For example, a Walking Ballista, who we have here, if you have a ton of mana, can be pretty good. I'm not sure how I feel about the card on the whole. It's no Hangerback Walker. But I think it probably, if it has some legs somewhere, it's probably in this deck. So that is it for Black-Green. All about the +1/+1 counters. Seems like lots of synergies to be had. Seems like a fun archetype to play. Let's move on now to Blue-White, where our signpost uncommon is Spire Patrol. Spire Patrol indicates to us that Blue-White is interested in basically the same thing it was interested in Kaladesh. Playing creatures with flying and abusing into the battlefield abilities. First, let's see what cards Blue and White have to give us into the battlefield abilities in Aether Revolt. Before we do, I want to explain what I mean here. We have a flyer, a 4-mana 3/2, which is a great rate. Not great rate, but a fine rate for a flyer. Also taps something down and keeps it from tapping when it enters the battlefield. So if you can blink this creature, if you can bounce it to your hand and use it again, you get a lot more uses out of its ability to tap a creature down. So let's talk about ways to abuse these. One of these is Dispersal Technician. Only works with artifacts, it should be noted. But there are artifacts with useful into the battlefield abilities. Illusionist Stratagem is a great card for this deck because you can blink 2 creatures. And remember, blinking the creatures also means they get to dodge removal or an aura drops off of them that was removal. And it also has a cantrip attached. Salvage Scuttler, again, only lets you return artifacts. Alley Evasion, which we saw before, lets you bounce a creature to your hand and then you can play it again. And we see Felidar Guardian again, who can be used to abuse any of the battlefield triggers, just as you can with Revolt, which is itself an into the battlefield trigger. We've also got Aegis Automaton, who we've seen before, who can return creatures to your hand and then let you replay them. Here's some into the battlefield abilities to abuse. You've got Trophy Mage, only going to be abusable if you have several 3-mana artifacts. Shipwreck Moray sort of here as a stand-in for any card that makes energy. This is one way to make sure you have a lot of energy because you can blink creatures and get more. Again, creatures with Revolt in White are going to be good because you automatically get the trigger when you blink it, so this will gain you 5. Dawnfeather Eagle can pump your entire team and give it Vigilance. Countless Gears Renegade, similarly, if you blink it, it's going to come with the servo. Deadeye Harpooner, going to turn into a kill spell. Servo Schematic, going to give you a free servo when it blinks. So now let's look at some flyers. Since I think this deck has lost a little bit of its synergy, there aren't as many into the battlefield triggers to abuse or as many ways to blink things. I think this deck has turned it a little more into a traditional blue-white skies deck. As you can see, some of the creatures that we've already looked at here have flying. And there's a lot more flyers, both in Kaladesh and Aether Revolt. For example, we've got our friend Aeronaut Admiral, you got Gira Osprey, Aether Swooper, Hinterland Drake, Skyship Plunderer, and then in Kaladesh you have even more of them to go around, not to mention other ways to blink things. Of course, Cloud Blazer is one of the best things to abuse the blink on, because drawing 2 and gaining 2 life more than once is insane. Acrobatic Maneuver helps you blink. Aether Trade Winds lets you bounce things. Aviary Mechanic lets you bounce things. Experimental Aviator comes into play with Thopters, so abusing that is insane. Glintnest Crane only worth abusing if you have a ton of different artifacts in your deck. Visionary Augmenter, a stand-in for any creature with Fabricate, but probably the best because it has Fabricate 2. And Wispy Angel is incredible. It's sort of like the ideal card for this deck. It's the card that maybe, well, Cloud Blazer's probably up there too. They're close. Very first pickable cards if you want to abuse into the battlefield triggers. And then there's also Decoction Module, who both makes you energy and can bounce creatures to your hand. There's also, of course, some rares that work well with this theme. We've got Angel of Invention, who you can use to be blinked and then put into play, more servos. You've got Cataclysmic Gearhulk. If you're abusing a Gearhulk trigger of any kind, it's pretty gross. It works well with Torrential Gearhulk as well. With Quicksmith Spy, it's not the best way to work, but you can make 2 artifacts have draw a card. And it's, especially if they've destroyed the artifact that you were drawing a card with, you can give another one draw a card. Solemn Recruit isn't bad to blink because you make sure it comes with a counter. And Call for Unity loves this deck because it can blink so much that every time you do it, you get another +1/+1 on your Call for Unity. All right, so that does it for Blue-White, who's basically a Blue-White Skies deck now, but still has a little bit of a blink sub-theme. It's not as strong as I think it used to be, just based on the new card. We're not going to see the same card pool that we saw before. The one Kaladesh pack isn't going to be able to get you a Wispweaver Angel or an Acrobatic Maneuver every time, so that's something to keep in mind. So, here we are at our final color pair, red-green. We made it. We got here. Where the signpost uncommon is Outland Boar. Outland Boar doesn't do anything fancy or really even push you in any sort of special synergistic direction. He's just a very efficient creature as a 4-mana 4/4 and has a nice ability in that he can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. There's a lot of those around, servos, for example. It's also, on turn 4, one of the best ways to kill him is like double blocking, and it's not going to be very easy to do that. Along with red-white, green-red is an aggro archetype. In Kaladesh, it had a bit of an energy sub-theme, and that is still here, even though it isn't reflected on the boar. Red-green isn't interested in using energy on silly things like drawing cards, though. It uses them to make attacks more effective. At its core, this deck is just an aggro deck that is devastating when it can curve out. We don't really have any special synergies to look at here. Instead, we're going to look at the creatures at the various points on the mana curve for this color pair to play to show how devastating this color pair can curve out. For example, 2-drops. These are all very efficient 2-drops. Aether Chaser is hard to block, makes servos. Druid of the Cowl is great in this deck because this deck has a very good high curve, like 4 and 5. If you can play one of your 4-drops or 5-drops a turn early, you're really getting there. Hidden Herbalists, just a decent 2/2 who gives you a little bit of upside. And Scrounging Bandar, who we talked about before, is just a good little 2/2 who also has some good late game utility because he can move his counters around. Then at 3, we've got Aetherstream Leopard, who's sort of our first card that really likes energy in these cards. He likes to use the energy to make himself bigger. Maulfist Revolutionary is just a great 3-drop with Trample, who also helps you a little bit with your energy sub-theme. Frontline Rebel, just a good 3-mana 3-drop. I mean, good's a strong word, but it does have 3 power and 3 toughness for 3. And we've also got Reckless Racer, who, yes, is better in red-white, but it's just a good 3-drop in any deck. And then at 4, we have Scrapper Champion. Here we suddenly have energy all over the place. We've got Scrapper Champion, who can use the energy to put counters on himself, and he's also got Double Strike, so he's a little scary. Aether Herder makes energy, so there's energy again, and it makes a servo token if you want when it attacks. If you have the energy, our friend Pima Aether Seer again is going to produce a lot of energy in this deck, and then you can use it to pump your creatures however, or use it to kill a good blocker if that's how you want to use it. Outland Boar, our friend, is there again, just an efficient 4-mana 4/4, who's not the easiest thing to kill, or in combat anyway. And then at 5, we've got Lotnu Sailback, who's definitely the bottom of the barrel here, but he is fine, a 5-mana 5/4. Lifecraft Cavalry gives you a 5-mana 4/4 with Trample, or a 6/6 if you can Revolt. And Ridgescale Tusker, who we've talked about before, is just great, pumps your whole team permanently with counters. Now, here's what you want from Kaladesh, sort of divided again by their mana cost. One of the things that made green, which was considered to be the most powerful color in Kaladesh, more or less so powerful, was how crazy its curve out could be in Kaladesh, and that's still true. You still have all of these really good cards from 2 to 5, and you still have access to them in your third pack, plus all the cards we just talked about. Seed Sculptor, Longtusk Cub, several of these have the energy theme, including the red-green gold card from the set. You've got Brazen Scourge with haste, Thriving Rhino, Malphus, Doorbuster makes things unable to block, Peema Outrider is 4/4 with trample, Arborback Stomper gives you life, has trample himself and is huge, and Riparian Tiger is, you know, just a 5-mana 4/4 who can use energy to make itself a 6/6, and it has trample. And that does it for red-green and for our entire archetype guide. So we made it to the end. Congratulations to you for getting there. Congratulations to me as well. I need a drink of water. Tomorrow, I will post the final video of Aether Revolt Limited Review Week, a discussion of the biggest bombs in the format. I hope this video was helpful for you. If it was, don't forget to click the like button. What archetype do you think looks like the best or most fun? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to make sure you catch future archetype guides and other great MTG content, don't forget to subscribe. Also, my videos are in part sponsored by 5colorcombo.com, a great website for your Magic needs. You can find great content there, including an app that can actually help you practice Aether Revolt drafts, help you draft these archetypes, get a feel for them, and a store. In that store, you can get use my discount code NEEDTOHONE5 to get a 5% discount. Anyway, thanks for watching.